And we have Maryam Al-Khawaja, co-director of the Gulf Center for Human Rights in Bahrain. The center does research and advocacy around 10 different countries. Maryam herself was detained. Her family, well, her father has been in jail for 5 years. Her sister has been in and out of jail and in and out of the courts. It's a real family of struggle, and the mother is holding it all together for all of them.
What I want to talk about with you today is, first of all, Bahrain, because of course that's the place where I'm from, and it's also the place that I've been working on the most for the past 5 years. But as was mentioned in the introduction, the Gulf Center, which I co-direct, actually covers 10 different countries, which is all of the 6 GCC countries, plus Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Yemen. And so I also wanted to reflect a little bit about the impact that the human rights situation in places like the GCC actually have on other countries in the region, and also the issue of international impunity that the GCC enjoys, unfortunately, today. To begin with Bahrain, what we saw, of course, in the beginning in 2011 was a knee-jerk reaction by the government to the protest movement. A protest movement that was peaceful and during which people were demanding basic rights and dignity and freedom. What we've seen since then is the government very successfully institutionalized the crackdown. What this means is that the main tool being used today to go after dissidents and to silence dissidents is the judiciary. The judiciary is run by the king's cousin. Most of the important ministers in the government today are members of the ruling family. And this means that they have complete control not only economically but also politically over the country. The way I like to describe it usually is that they run the country like a family business. It's a poorly run family business, but definitely a family business. And right now, Bahrain has a population of about 600, 700,000 people, of citizens. And at any given time, you will find between 3,000 to 4,000 political prisoners in the prison system. This makes, according to a study that is done on prisons by a research center in the UK, Bahrain actually per capita has the largest amount of political prisoners in the region. What we see, of course, is this very specific system and process that is used. We're still seeing, as was mentioned in the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry in 2011, that was fully accepted by the king, and supposedly that they were supposed to also implement the different recommendations that were made in the report. The process starts with usually house raids in the middle of the night, so anytime between midnight and 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. in the morning, civilian clothed police will break into people's homes, take people out of their beds, usually beat them, and then take them to the CID, which is the Criminal Investigation Department. During their stay at the Criminal Investigation Department, that's when they are usually subjected to enforced disappearance. And this could be anything from hours to days to weeks, depending on how long they need to torture or mistreat them to get them to sign confessions extracted under torture. After that, they show up in one of the prisons. We have 2 prisons, Dry Docks and Joe Prison. And then they are subjected to an unfair trial with lack of due process, after which they are then sentenced. And we've seen a correlation between the international attention about the situation on the ground and the impact on the human rights situation inside Bahrain. And so 2015, for example, we witnessed how there was less international attention on the situation in Bahrain, and how during 2015 there was a spike in the use of the death penalty against political prisoners. We also saw a spike in the number of arbitrary arrests that were occurring per week. And we also saw an increase in the use of, or the clampdown on public space. And so what we've seen since 2015 is also complete control by the government over public space to make sure that people can't protest on the main streets. What's important about Bahrain is that it also reflects on the situation regionally. Because in Bahrain we have something that it looks very similar to the situation in Iraq pre-ISIS. We have a military and police that are made up of one sect and one ideology, which is the Wahhabi ideology, which is a similar ideology to that of ISIS. We've already seen 4 members of the military in Bahrain defecting to ISIS, to go join ISIS. The person who is regarded as being second in charge in ISIS under al-Baghdadi is also a Bahraini. His name is Turki bin Ali. And so we see that there is actually a huge relation between how things play out in Bahrain and also their impact regionally. what is very problematic is that, there's this quote that I really like that says, those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it, and those who do study history are doomed to stand aside and watch others repeat it. And I think that that's exactly what happens to us. We see the mistakes that have happened in the past. We see how the United States, for example, said the right thing about Iraq, but they said it too late. They said that Maliki sectarian policies is what helped create a platform for ISIS in the region, in Iraq. And unfortunately, despite seeing the exact same situation playing out in Bahrain, they refuse to acknowledge that it's the same, to acknowledge that they need to make a public statement on that now before it's too late. Despite, of course, our consistent meetings with them and attempting to get them to do that. What's important also about Bahrain is that due to the lack of any kind of basic freedoms like freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and association, and basically any space for people to gather or to express their anger and their opinions or criticism of the government, that along with the security situation regionally and the fact that ISIS has already made several threats of attacks in Bahrain, and they've already conducted suicide bombings in places like the Eastern Province in Saudi Arabia, which is very close to Bahrain and impacts the situation in Bahrain, but also the attacks that have happened in Kuwait. This, of course, relates to Bahrain because people in Bahrain feel like if there were to be attacks by ISIS in Bahrain, there will be no protection from the government for the people, given that the people in Bahrain are already targets of their own government. So you can imagine that the lack of any kind of space for basic freedoms, plus the regional security situation and the threats coming from ISIS, turns Bahrain into a powder keg. What this means is that we're currently at a situation right now where we have a window of opportunity where the Bahraini government can actually be pressured into doing the right thing. And Bahrain is one of the only countries in the region that actually has the capacity and the capability to become another quote-unquote success story of the Arab Spring. Not many other countries have that. But if Bahrain is not pushed to do the right thing, if the Al-Khalifas in Bahrain are not pushed to reform, if they're not pushed to conduct any sort of accountability, then we're going to see Bahrain, unfortunately, turn into a situation of violence as we have seen with other countries in the region. Now, when we're talking about the impact of the situation in Bahrain, but also the impact of the security situation regionally, we see how the Bahrainis, for example, because they enjoy international impunity, it means that they also enjoy, there's a culture of national or local impunity as well. And these two things feed off of each other. And this is something that we've been saying for 5 years to all of the different governments we've been meeting with, that we will only see local accountability in places like Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, Kuwait, wherever it is, when there is international accountability. The problem isn't that the GCC countries believe they can get away with anything. The problem is that they're right about it. The problem is that they conduct violation after violation and war crime after war crime, and there is no accountability. And I think the best example of that we've seen is when the Netherlands tabled a resolution at the UN calling for an investigation and accountability for war crimes for all parties in the Yemen conflict. And Saudi Arabia, backed by the United States and the United Kingdom, was able to get the Netherlands to withdraw that resolution, only to then table their own resolution, which basically said that the Saudi-backed Yemeni government would conduct their own investigation that would not be followed by any type of accountability. And when any country can have that kind of impact on the UN level, the Human Rights Council, which was set up to protect human rights, when a country is able to go and impact the Human Rights Council for there to be no respect for human rights or accountability, that is the state that we're in right now when it comes to the GCC and their level of impunity internationally. And this is where the problem lies. Now, generally, when we've talked to different governments like the United States government and the UK, we also try to explain to them that their credibility issues in the GCC impact their ability to have any kind of influence in other countries as well. When the United States tries to get involved in places like Iraq and Syria, it's not, people there understand that the United States does things based on personal benefits, which means they see how the United States supports countries like Saudi Arabia in committing war crimes in a place like Yemen, and at the same time is talking about the issue of war crimes in places like Iraq and Syria. And the thing is, you can't have those kind of double standards and consider yourself as a credible player in any situation anywhere in the world. If you're going to be a credible player when it comes to holding people accountable on war crimes and human rights violations, you need to be credible to everyone. And the best example of that, and I've said this for 5 years, and I wish people actually listened in the different governments, that at the end of the day, people will not ask, when the people want to see if a government actually upholds the standards of human rights and the standards of democracy and so on, they're not going to ask how well they held their enemies accountable to those standards. They're going to ask how well or how applicable that was to their allies. And if they can't hold their allies accountable for war crimes and for human rights situation, then they don't have credibility anywhere else either. One of the other shifts that we're seeing that I think is also very concerning is the shift, especially in Europe right now, because of the refugee crisis. We're seeing different countries in the West starting to shift their support and their position on supporting civil society and human rights defenders into a position of supporting or putting more support and funding into humanitarian aid and into fighting extremism and radicalization. It's problematic on many different levels. Of course, it's very important for there to be support in humanitarian aid. That's not something that we would argue at any time of any day. What we do argue, though, is that if you want to fight radicalization and extremism, the best way to do that is to support the human rights defenders and the civil society who are on the ground and at the front lines of fighting extremism and radicalization. Because those are people who are risking their lives on a daily basis to make sure that their country doesn't fall into chaos. And when countries like the GCC or others are able to silence human rights defenders and civil society by putting them in prison or by threatening them, and there's no support coming from anywhere, then we're going to see a situation where there is more radicalization and there is more extremism within these societies. And so the issue of supporting human rights defenders and civil society should always be at the forefront of any efforts to fight extremism or terrorism or radicalization. Finally, just to kind of round up, which is always difficult to do when talking about the GCC, I think that, from here on out, what we're looking at is I usually try to be optimistic in my talks, so it seems to be more and more difficult with every year that passes. We're looking at a situation right now where, given my experience in doing advocacy, especially in the West for the past 5 years, I don't think we're going to see a shift in the foreign policies, unfortunately, of countries like the United States and the United Kingdom. Instead of accountability and respect for human rights, we saw the United Kingdom announcing that they're opening their first Near East base since the 1970s in Bahrain. This was basically regarded by the Bahraini government as a reward. And we're seeing different countries like the US, like France, like Germany, like Sweden, like others, selling arms to places like Bahrain, like Saudi Arabia, and so on. And so I don't think that we are going to see politicians suddenly waking up one day and saying, well, we made mistakes, let's learn from them. But I think, like I said, we're doomed to sit by and watch them repeat those very same mistakes in the very same region where they committed the same mistakes before. What we can do, though, is I think that one thing that has changed to the better, and to end on an optimistic note, when we talked about Saudi Arabia or Bahrain or the GCC 5 years ago, people would go like, oh yeah, those oil-rich countries where you have, those fat sheikhs and their barrels of petrol in their backyards. That's how people viewed the GCC generally. And when you talked about the GCC, it was almost as if the populations there didn't exist. The only thing that existed were these monarchies that ran the show and that did business with the West and, went to vacation in places like London and Paris. But I think that has shifted. When you talk about the GCC today, people do think of Saudi Arabia as a country that commits human rights violations. And you do see comparisons made between Saudi Arabia and ISIS and the laws and the regulations that they actually implement on their own society. And we also saw this, of course, with the executions that happened in the beginning of this year. After, 47 people were executed by the Saudi government. And so that is a positive change. The fact that there is a shifting discourse when it comes to talking about the GCC and when it comes to talking about the region in general, I think that is something very positive. Unfortunately, we're not necessarily seeing it in the diplomatic circles, but I think it always starts with populations in different countries starting to understand the way things are and the way that the situation is in those different countries. Because at the end of the day, that is what creates discourse and rhetoric. And when you have people like Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton and Trump and all these other people going around for debates, these are questions that need to be posed and asked. Hopefully by the people who are asking the questions as the debate goes on, but also by people in the crowd. We'd love to see people actually come up and ask people in a debate, presidential candidates, what would you do about Saudi Arabia, who is executing people and crucifying people and committing war crimes in places like Yemen? So I think in that sense, that is something that I am optimistic about. I think people are smarter when it comes to the GCC countries. But we need to start seeing that in the diplomatic circles for it to actually make a difference in regards to foreign policy and human rights in general. Thank you.
Thanks to both of our speakers.
I think that, generally I believe if anyone wants to criticize any religion, that's free speech. So they should be allowed to do that. But when it comes to the issue, I think that Saudi Arabia needs to be criticized, but not as, oh my God, they're ruining and corrupting Islam. They need to be criticized because, oh my God, they're committing war crimes and conducting human rights violations. I think creating that link is actually reinforcing the identity that they're trying to create, which is not something we want to give them. Saudi Arabia wants to be presented as basically the protector of the Islamic faith. And if we start presenting them in that way too, we're actually giving them exactly what they want. The Saudis, Al Saud in general, are not, if you look at their practices and their conduct, they can identify as Muslims. I'm not going to sit here and say anyone's not a Muslim if they say they are. But generally speaking, what they're doing is not based on Islam. What they're doing is based on economic and political gains. And so I think we have to be very careful about starting to identify the Saudis in a way that would actually give them more ammunition and the identity. One of the things that the Saudi king loves to do is to present himself as the custodian of the holy mosques, right? And the thing is that is one of the things that he uses for legitimacy, so that if there was ever an uprising against him, he is able to say, you're not just uprising against the Saudi king, you're uprising against Islam itself because I'm the custodian of the two holy mosques. And so that's not a position or ammunition that we should be giving them by saying we need to make that immediate link between Islam and Al Saud. On the issue of the United States position or the Western countries, that is not something we disagree on. I've never said, and I never will say, that the United States or the West ever does anything because they're actually fighting for democracy or human rights. Yes, we might have examples of that on very specific issues, but generally it boils down to economic interests and security interests. And that is why when I meet with the US government or the UK government or the German government or whoever it is, I don't tell them, well, I know you love human rights, so please come support human rights in Bahrain. No, what I say is, for your own security interests and for your own economic interests, you need to make sure Bahrain is stable, and the only way that Bahrain will be stable is if human rights are protected. And so that's something that we understand very well. Now, what is it that makes the West different to other countries? And this is something that I actually said at Congress a few years ago, and I got quite a big response from Congress members. I told them that this was like 3-4 years ago, so Syria wasn't the way it is right now, which is why it was easier to make that comparison back then. But basically I said, that people in Bahrain regard the United States to be to Bahrain what Russia is to Syria? That Russia is basically supporting the Syrian regime against an uprising, the exact same way the United States is supporting the Bahraini regime against a peaceful uprising. And the Americans, they were shocked. They were like, oh my God, people are comparing us to Russia? Like, that doesn't happen. And so there is that shock value, but there is this sense of identity, but also sense of we are the world police and we are righteous and we do things because we actually believe in democracy and human rights. And so that's actually a conversation that you can have. If I go sit with the Russians, I'm not going to have a conversation about human rights, because from the get-go I know they don't care about that. But when governments say that democracy is the cornerstone of their foreign policy, when they say that human rights is the cornerstone of their foreign policy, then I expect them to uphold that cornerstone and to actually see it implemented in their foreign policy, which is not the case. In regards to your question about political versus human rights, look, you can't be a human rights activist without having an influence on politics. The only way human rights are respected is if the politicians actually start implementing respect for human rights and actually setting up institutions that make sure that that there will be respect for human rights. So there is always that intercrossing section. What the difference between a human rights activist and a political activist is that a human rights activist doesn't have an agenda other than human rights. A political activist is always going to have an agenda. There's some political thing that he wants or she wants to achieve. Whereas a human rights defender really doesn't care who's in government and really doesn't care what they identify themselves as. What they care is that the fundamental freedoms and the fundamental human rights that are supposed to be respected are respected, regardless of who's in government. So for me personally in Bahrain, I don't care if it's the Al-Khalifas who are in power, or Al-Wafaq, or if it was, my grandfather or my uncle. They need to respect human rights. That's what it boils down to. And so that's the main difference between human rights and political activism. But, and I'll end with this, I know I've gone on for too long, but there is an issue with the way that there is a gap in identifying human rights activism, because I know that was the point you wanted me to bring up. There is a gap between the way that human rights defenders are identified in the West versus the East. And what we've seen in the Middle East, for example, is that when you're a human rights defender, you believe that you're supposed to be at the front lines. You're supposed to be organizing the protests. You're supposed to be the one going to prison. So you lead by example. In the West, they regard human rights defenders as being activists who are supposed to do monitoring at protests, not actually participate, and who are supposed to be nuanced in the sense that they stand on the sideline and watch. And this is problematic because then human rights defenders, when they go on the streets and are on the front lines, sometimes will get identified by organizations, international organizations based in the West, as being political activists. And what is very problematic about that is that as soon as a human rights defender is identified as a political activist by international organizations, this actually gives those governments ammunition to go after them and put them in prison. And so there is, I think that one of the problems we face within this NGO community today is this gap of what the definition of a human rights defender is. Thank you. To put it simply, the GCC countries, the only GCC country that actually has an NGO law is Bahrain. And that NGO law is so bad that when the Egyptians were trying to make their NGO law worse, people were saying, is it as bad as Bahrain's? And so that's like how bad the Bahraini NGO law. Basically, it gives the Ministry of Social Affairs the right to take over an organization and replace the board and the directors with employees from the ministry to run the organization if they don't like what they're doing. Pretty simple, right? In regards to political participation, I mean, just to add a quick note on the NGO law, in Kuwait, they have a list of rules and regulations for NGOs, but not an actual law. In Saudi Arabia, if you want to open up an NGO, you basically have to go up to the council or the person who's in charge of like the council that makes these decisions, and then it's you and your luck. Whoever is sitting on that council that day will sit there and decide, do I want to give them permission or not? And so there isn't an actual process or application that you can go through to see if you can actually open up an NGO or not. So space for civil society almost doesn't exist in most GCC countries. I mean, you have political prisoners in pretty much all of the GCC countries. In Saudi Arabia, all of the members of ACPRA, which was one of the organizations that opened up in 2006, I believe all of them now are in prison. And so you're seeing this clampdown on civil society space where there's basically no space really left. In regards to political participation, to give you an idea of how things stand, in Bahrain it's illegal to have a political party. You can only have a political society. So parties are illegal. And in 2011, some registered political societies were allowed to run. So like Al-Wafaq, for example, because they were seen as less radical than the others. They were allowed to actually conduct protests and do interviews and travel and so on. Once they refused to participate in the parliamentary elections last year, no, that was 2014, there was widespread condemnation from the international community, as in, why would Al-Wafaq not participate in the parliamentary elections when, despite the gerrymandering and despite all of the crackdown and despite the fact that they would lose all legitimacy popularly, they should have participated anyway. And there were actually several Western countries that put out public statements saying that Al-Wafaq should have participated in the parliamentary elections. Anyway, the General Secretary of Al-Wafaq is currently sitting in a prison cell, serving a 4-year sentence, waiting for his appeal. And so that also gives you pretty much a good idea of where political participation actually exists, or the space for political participation in these countries. You have to understand that the GCC is all run by families, all of it. In some situations, of course, they're not copy-paste. There are differences between every GCC country, but they're all run by families. And what the difference between some and the others is that they all steal the loaf. Some will give crumbs back and some won't. That's the difference, right? But they all steal the loaf. Like, that's what it comes down to.
Hold on.
I don't think it's stable. I mean, given the current economic situation in the GCC, it's definitely not stable. It's definitely not sustainable. We're looking at a situation right now where petrol has gone double the price in places like Bahrain and Kuwait. We're seeing subsidies for things like meat and other things being withdrawn by the government. You had the Emir of Kuwait coming out on national television and saying, we've been taking care of our citizens from the day they're born until the day they die, and that needs to end. We're not doing that anymore. And so we're seeing a complete change in the economic situation. In the UAE and Qatar, we're not seeing it as much as the other countries, but the ones being hit the hardest are Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Bahrain. And I think that is going to impact, because there's a difference between an uprising that is done on political grounds for political and social change, and there's a difference between an uprising of the hungry. And I think that that's something that in a few years' time we're going to start seeing in the GCC. Well, I mean, I'm not a political analyst in any capacity, so you have to take everything I say with a grain of salt. Of course, I'm a human rights defender. I'm not sure how it will play out. I think it depends a lot on the influence that ISIS has at that time. I think it depends a lot on how it crumbles, because one of the things about Saudi Arabia is you have 3 different factions within the ruling family. One faction controls the royal guard, one faction controls the military, one faction controls the Ministry of Interior. And so the question is there going to be an uprising, or is there going to be basically a crisis within the ruling family itself, where you have different members of the ruling family fighting each other? Because those are 2 very different scenarios. What I think is the biggest question is, either way, whether it's an uprising, which is, I think the second scenario is more likely, whether it's an uprising or an implosion within the ruling family, what happens when the wrong people get their hands on all of the weapons that the United States has been selling to Saudi Arabia? I think that's the question that needs to be asked. And that's the question that needs to be made to DOD time and time again. You're selling billions of dollars worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia. You call them your allies now. What happens when they're no longer able to control the situation anymore? What happens then? Because what we're seeing now is nothing compared to what we're going to see once it all starts to fall apart. No, the Saudis definitely have a huge influence. They definitely prop up the Al-Khalifas in Bahrain. And the only reason why we were not able to change the situation in Bahrain in 2011 was because Saudi troops came in over that darn bridge that we have between Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. And so that is definitely an influence that is there, and we understand that influence. But I think that if Bahrain was to be pressured by allies, which are also the allies of Saudi Arabia, to actually reform, to implement accountability, in the framework of stability, especially security, stability, and economic stability, that would be one of the only ways to do it. Generally, I think that Saudi Arabia, if there was to be a violent uprising, which is also a possibility in the coming years, and the Al-Khalifas were basically brought down by the people, it would be very difficult for Saudi Arabia to go in. They might try it because we've seen that they don't always make the smartest decisions. So they might actually try to go in and take over Bahrain. But that would also be difficult given that we have the US Fifth Fleet there. And so they would have to do it after they come to an agreement with the US. Excuse me. So that's definitely a possibility of the Saudis taking complete control over Bahrain. But I think that there are ways to circumvent that, basically. I mean, I think that it's very different from country to country. You don't have like a one case scenario that applies for all, right? So it's definitely from one scenario to another. It's very. For example, when I was in Iraqi Kurdistan, one of the things that I learned is that every single NGO that operates in Iraqi Kurdistan is backed by a certain political group, because if they're not backed by them, then they have no protection, which means that they're under threat. And the threats are serious because they get death threats, they get threats of violence, and so on. And so that makes it very difficult to actually work with civil society in Kurdistan because it means that they're not 100% independent. But I think that when I was talking about the issue of defining a human rights defender, I wasn't talking about like the sense that anyone could come out and call themselves a human rights defender, right? Because we've seen this actually happen. We've seen it happen in Bahrain, where we've seen politicians come out and say, I'm going to start fighting for human rights, and this makes me a human rights defender. The difference between a political activist and a human rights defender is that the human rights defender, the only thing they have, I mean, the strongest tool of any human rights defender is their credibility. If you don't have credibility, you cannot work as a human rights defender. It's that simple. Because as soon as you are seen as being, working for this political agenda or being a part of this political group or whatever it is, that actually impacts your credibility internationally, and you are not able anymore to be seen as a credible source for human rights in any circle. And so you are no longer able to work on human rights issues. So it's not that political activists can't be human rights defenders, but human rights defenders can't be political activists, if you know what I mean. To expand on that just a little bit. Human rights defenders, the first rule that you have to incorporate as a human rights defender is all rights for all human beings, which means it's regardless of any background, sect, religion, gender, whatever it is, right? All rights, there's no exceptions. All rights for all human beings. And so that's the number one rule. If you believe that there's an exception, like for example, if you believe that the Yazidis should not have rights because they're a minority and they don't matter as much, or if you believe that everyone has rights except Shias, or if you believe that everyone has rights except Christians, then you can't be a human rights defender. You have to believe in okay, you have to believe in all rights for all human beings. And the second thing is that, again, like I said earlier, it's the issue of not having a political agenda. It means you are willing to come out and criticize whoever is committing a human rights violation, regardless. I'll give you a very quick example, and I'll end with that. When in 2011, when the Saudi troops came into Bahrain, backed by the UAE troops, there was a huge reaction from the Bahraini community against that, of course, and they viewed it as an occupation. There were certain groups within Kuwait that supported the entrance of the GCC troops in Bahrain to put down the uprising, based on a lot of issues, one of them being sectarianism. 2 years later, those very same groups in Kuwait then started protesting for the very same demands that the Bahrainis were protesting for in 2011, right? And they were cracked down upon by their government. And so as Bahraini civil society, the first thing we did is we said we stand in solidarity with the Kuwaitis who are being beaten by police and who have justified demands about human rights and freedoms. And so the Bahraini community, we faced a backlash by the Bahraini community because they said, how can you go and defend someone who 2 years ago was supporting the entrance of the GCC troops into Bahrain? And so our response was, well, if they refuse to support us because of sectarianism, and then we refuse to support them because they didn't support us to begin with, then what's the difference between us and them? And that's where we draw the line. As human rights defender, you will stand with anyone, and I mean anyone, who is fighting for human rights and who's fighting for freedom and dignity. And that includes Wahhabis and Salafis who are sitting in Guantanamo Bay, who I might not agree with on anything, but they are being incarcerated unlawfully and unjustly, and as a human rights defender, I have a responsibility to stand for them and to fight for their rights. That's what differentiates a human rights defender from a political activist. I mean, first of all, the numbers tell the truth on that. For every one person killed by ISIS, Assad kills 7. And so it's just factually incorrect. But on the other hand, I think it's very problematic that we have this view frame of it's either Assad or the terrorists. And that's exactly what these dictators do, is they create an enemy, and then they say, well, it's us or them, it's us or the extremists. You either take the extremists or you take us, and we're the lesser evil. And that's not true, because if you look at we always focus so much on the issue of terrorist groups and terrorism and terrorist organizations like Al-Khawaja, like ISIS, like whoever it is. And we rarely ever talk about state terrorism.
Right.
We rarely ever identify state terrorism. And that's what it is. When a government, when a president slaughters his own people, that is state-sponsored terrorism. And when a government like Saudi Arabia commits war crimes like it does in places like Yemen, that is state terrorism. The only difference between ISIS and Assad is that Assad is recognized as a government, and ISIS is not. That's the only difference. So this entire issue of it's us versus the terrorists, no, you are the terrorists.
Absolutely.
It's one of the two faces of the same coin. It doesn't differ. And so we need to be very careful about allowing ourselves to fall into that trap of, oh, do we support, the necktie-wearing terrorist, or do we support the long-bearded terrorist? Because at the end of the day, there's no difference between the two.
Any last words?
I usually like to end whatever panel I'm on with some positivity or some being a little bit more optimistic than pessimistic. And so I would say, and this is a story that I share with every panel that I sit on, so sorry for those who have seen me speak before because you've heard this a million times. What we need to regard, when we talk about these revolutions and so on, we live in this age where we expect everything to happen so fast. And that's why 5 years into it, we're all talking about the failed revolutions and the failed Arab uprisings and the failed this and the failed that. And we need to recognize from history that revolutions don't take 5 years. Revolutions take a long time. It's a long and bloody and violent, usually, process. And so with that in mind, they're not failed. We're going through the process right now. And what we need to remember day after day is that living as human beings, actually being happy, being able to be alive, is a part of the resistance. It's a part of the revolution. The day that we stop living is the day that they've won. And so we need to every single day remind ourselves that the first victory that we've had was in 2011 when people in Tunisia and Egypt and Morocco and Bahrain and Yemen and Syria took to the streets and demanded change. That was the victory. And that is something we need to celebrate every single day. What comes next is secondary to that. That is our initial victory. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming. Well, as you probably know, we have a fairly sizable Yemeni community here in New York. And on occasion they mobilize, like around dictators and other things. But we need to get some folks together.
Yeah, the only thing that